Okay, now we can easily, or maybe some professors have gone directly to the theology of ministry according to Vatican II, but I would like to set the scene for Vatican II so that you will be able to understand exactly why Vatican II took the time to do the kind of, or to issue the kind of documents that it did, precisely because this is the basis of our renewed understanding of ministry. I'll discuss it more in next week when we talk about the theology of ministry according to Vatican II. But what I would like to do today is to set the scene for the coming of Vatican II. And the reason for it is and there are several reasons for it. You know, contextualizing Vatican II is, for me, always very important. You will not appreciate Vatican II, especially those of you who were born. Most of you were born already in, what do you call this, in the late 90s, no? Or maybe early 90s, up to, none of you are born, what do you call this, in the 2000s, no? They're already a bit older than people. Anybody born in 2000? Nobody? Okay, before 1990s then. So you'd not be able to appreciate perhaps what Vatican II was all about. It was between 62 and 65, 62, 63, 64, and 65, the 4 sessions of the Second Vatican Council. That was just the beginning of my minor seminary. Well, I entered the minor seminary actually in 64. That was almost, Vatican II was almost finishing, but we could already experience the changes that were taking place at that time in the seminary. But there is a much more important reason actually for contextualizing Vatican II and its reform. One very important reason is that this is going to be the paradigm that will be used from here on. Just as the Council of Trent was the paradigm for the years or the centuries after 1565, so also Vatican II is going to be the paradigm that has been used since the 1960s up to our own time and maybe even beyond. I don't think Vatican III is really necessary. Vatican II is still largely unimplemented. I think there are some that have been implemented already, but it's not the full spirit of Vatican II is not yet fully implemented. So the way towards Vatican II was what I would consider a very arduous journey, and there were a good number of casualties. Casualties meaning there were a lot of people who suffered, there were people who were criticized, were people who eventually were what do you call this? Were forbidden by the official church from publishing. But eventually, of course, Vatican II sort of vindicated them, and then many of their ideas actually were embraced by the Second Vatican Council. But a more important reason is the fact that even today, not everybody had embraced Vatican II. The reform movement of Vatican II is not embraced by everybody. And there are even people who are going against Vatican II. You know, when you hear about the Tridentine Masses, or Masses in Latin, and then the whole idea of the kind of spirituality or the kind of piety that is developing in some areas in the church, in my opinion, these are going back to the pre-Vatican II times. I think we need to be looking forward to something that is much more challenging than simply going back to old ways. Some of the old ways may have been important, may have been not good, but we need to, in a way, update, because we need to understand that the church, in order for the church to be of consequence, to be relevant to people of today, they need to keep pace with the rest of society. And if we don't keep pace with the rest of society, what happened in the Council of Trent and Vatican I is going to happen to us, the same thing in Vatican II. In other words, we probably will be so far behind that it will take another Vatican III in order for the church to update itself and to be on step with the rest of the world. So the insistence on the old Latin rites, I think, needs to be explained, and it has to be explained from a historical context. And the better way to understand it is to see it where it's coming from and exactly what it is aiming to do. Now, we have discussed some of these things previously in our last session when I talk about the 17th century um, what they call it, French School of Spirituality. Among them, of course, Saint Vincent de Paul was part of the French School of Spirituality. But I'll speak more about this in the sense of from a wider context. All right. So in this particular chapter, I will be talking about actually three three periods. Vatican I, that is the period from 1800s to 1900s. Then towards the church renewal. Where are you? That's from 1900 to 1965. Then, of course, 1965, Vatican II and post-Vatican II. Okay, if you see the beautiful picture there of the Piazza San Pietro, this is the Piazza. That road going all the way to the Tiber, to the river, is called Via della Conciliazione. Okay. Now, all the section here that you see is what we call Vatican, the present-day Vatican Church. Over there, near the what is this? Near the Rhine, you have the Adrian's Castle, which was pretty much the border of the what we call the Vatican City. Although when you go to Rome, you hardly see any what is this, any border really, except for the wall, which are only in existence in some parts of Rome now, but it's not. Via della Conciliazione, and then you San Pietro, the Piazza of San Pietro. You might think it's very big. It's really, really very big. But from certain angles, you find that it's so near to you, so close to you. But then when you walk, it's still a long, long way to go. Anyway, when in this treatment, I would talk about historical background, what is the ecclesiological framework, and then, of course, later on, the theology of ministry. First, in the first two periods, and then next session, next week, we will be talking about the theology of ministry in Vatican II. Okay, so ministry in Vatican I. This is probably what St. Peter looked like in around 1870s, 1880s. Okay. Now, kind of a historical context. The church in the 19th century, in the 1800s, I don't know if you have already finished in your church history class this particular period, but I think it's good for us to be reminded. In the 1800s, the institutional church experienced a great deal of threats. Not only we're talking about the threats of the Protestant reformers, that was still 300 years before that, but it continued to be a threat. According to from the point of view of the institutional Roman Catholic Church, that was always a threat. Protestantism is always a threat. Anything that is associated with the Reformation, the church, institutional church, would always do away with, or will always put a question mark on. But not only on the part of religion or spirituality, but also on the part of philosophy. As for you who have already taken history of philosophy, from the 1500s on, we're talking here about the modern period or the period of the Enlightenment, eventually in the 1800s, period of the Enlightenment. Basically, it was a philosophy that, in a way, put into question the authority of the church in regard to not just on spiritual matters, but especially on what we would call human matters in regard to humanity, in regard to secular life. Although the word secular would not come until several centuries later. But modern philosophy basically declared a kind of an independence or autonomy from the church, even from Aristotelian philosophy, or from the kind of philosophy that has been adopted in the church, which is basically the patristic time. You have talking about the Neoplatonist Augustinian philosophy. And then, of course, the time of the Middle Ages, you are talking about Aristotle and in Thomas Aquinas. But here, Rene Descartes, cogito ergo sum, starting with the whole idea of the use of reason. If I'm able to use my reason, then I can determine what I should think, what I should believe, or how I should act. So reason becomes the yardstick for evaluating things, not Bible, not church authorities, not religion, but reason. But during this time also, especially in the 1700s, we're talking about political, scientific, and social revolutions. Uh, for example, the revolution, the French Revolution. French Revolution was 1789. The American Revolution was 1776. Of course, in the 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte would restore the monarchy. First of all, his own empire, his own emperorship. Then eventually, of course, the French, the ancient regime of the French nobility, but it was short-lived because eventually the Third Republic of the French took over. So all kinds of revolutions, but there was also what we call the scientific revolution or industrial revolution. People were going to the cities because in the cities they would find work, and where will they work? They work in the factories. It was already the beginning of the what we would call the industrial revolution, as well as the rise of nation states, meaning to say independent nations. They were declaring independence from the big empire like what is this institutions like the Holy Roman Empire, or like the Papal States according to the Pope, or at that time, of course, in the 1700s and the 1800s, it was the British Empire. British Empire was so huge; it was all over the world. In fact, the some of the I forgot now who it was, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, of the British Empire, said that it is so large, what do you call this, an empire, the sun never sets. Meaning to say, wherever you go, all throughout the world, you would find traces or parts of the British Empire. And of course, the British Empire lost in the Second World War. First World War and the Second World War. And eventually, the American Empire took over. Now, so these are all things that were happening. By the way, previous to that, in the 1500s and 1600s, it was the Spanish and Portuguese empires that were really very, very strong. So we're talking here about Europe. And the reason we're discussing about European Christianity is because that is where we have, in terms of Christianity in the Philippines, we have inherited that from the Europeans. Now, also, the church experienced the loss of temporal power, meaning papal states. The Pope was no longer as strong a temporal power as he used to be. The papacy, to the papacy was attached all kinds of benefits, all kinds of properties from where they were drawing income by means of taxes, of course. Now, when the Italian leaders started to claim what is this different parts of the papal states for the formation of what we now call the modern day Italy, then the church slowly had to give up those papal states. It was taken over by the Italian, what do you call this? Italian leaders. Garibaldi and company, and they formed their own Vittorio Emanuele, the first emperor of the Republic of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele. Now, what happens to the church? There is something that's going to happen to the church, of course. What was the response of the church in regard to this? Let's say from after the Council of Trent to the time of Vatican II. Well, we already know how Trent responded to the idea of reform. They tried to reform also, even within the church, they tried to reform. They did not address specifically the theology of the reformers, although they were answering some of their objections, etc., etc. But the answers they were using, of course, was basically Aristotelian scholastic medieval philosophy. Okay. But it was also a time of restoration, going back to the good old times. And the good old times they were thinking of was basically the High Middle Ages. And that is the kind of, for many people in the church, that was the high point, that was the best expression of being church, the High Middle Ages, with all this, ritual and just the whole idea of the Pope having all the power, the Pope and the bishops having all the power, both spiritual and temporal. But the church at this time, especially in the 1800s, was also ignoring science and technology. You remember again the case of Galileo. Galileo was still in the 1500s. But eventually that same kind of attitude was adopted by the institutional church. They did not want to give credence to science and technology because, of course, that meant the church would be losing its power over people. Because now science and technology would be used as the gauge of whether this particular idea is viable or is understandable, or especially if it is practical. If it's practical. So the church was insisting on its own power and influence, not just from the defensive kind of attitude, but really trying to assert that the church is still. And you can imagine if the church had joined with the state for so long, for almost 1,000 years, you just cannot get over the fact that you are losing that kind of power, just like that. Because there are sciences and technologies that are coming up and then questioning even what you are teaching. People started to discredit the Bible from the point of view of science. You talk about the stories of creation. Stories of creation cannot be proven by science. In fact, science would contradict it. Okay, so, and then of course the church would say, no, the Bible is right, etc., etc. So in the end, the kind of theology that was adopted by the church at that time would be more a defensive kind of theology, more apologetical theology, trying to argue on the credibility and the authenticity of the church teaching. But of course, in view of the fact that there's so many people who are beginning to question already the way the church presents reality, which is so very different from what is being experienced by many people, many ordinary people. The church was very fine with cathedrals and basilicas and romantic movement kind of stuff. But majority of the people are suffering. They are actually laborers. So in other words, there's a big discrepancy between the church and especially the church powers, those who are in power in the church, and the rest of the community. They belong to the church by baptism, yes, but they are what are they experiencing? Much more difficult, a lot of difficulties, and of course a lot of struggle. Okay, so what is the church that we find in Vatican I? The idea of a fortress church was the image that comes to mind. In other words, The church was being attacked everywhere, even by religious people, the Protestants, even by scientists, on the part of the academe, on the part of the philosophical part, but also being attacked by, well, this new group, people who are more in favor of science, technology, the industrial revolution, because that is where they were earning their money. That is the place. So if that is able to provide them with the money, then why do I have to stick with the church? All I experience in the church is that I am, well, practically a slave to the power wielders in the church itself. Okay, so the French Revolution in 1789 shook the foundations of European society. What it basically did was to make people, uh, awaken people and their ability to change what is their experience, what is their being experience. In other words, revolt. We can, we can, we can change the situation if we take arms, if we do something. And that is because they were now empowered not only by rationalism, but by the whole idea that you can determine your own fate by what you do. Don't just simply obey what the church does. And the church was able to, in a way, make people obey the commands and the regulations of the church, because always that there is that hanging thing, the hanging sword of the spiritual. People are still afraid about being sent to hell for doing this or doing that. And in a way, that is what the church was holding on to. Fear, in other words. People were afraid that if they opposed the power wielders in the church, they might just end up going to hell. That's still a very, very strong uh, feeling at that time. As I said, after Napoleon Bonaparte, there was the restoration of the ancient regime, restoration of the monarchy, but only for a short time. But more importantly, the rise of nation states in the democratic countries, starting to question precisely the authority of the church. Now, if you have nation states, in other words, countries, independence, you have to remember that the Philippine Revolution against Spain was already being influenced by what was happening in Europe at that time, because they were starting to assert their own identity as a country or as a people. Then they started to rebel against the colonizers such as Spain, such as Portugal, such as the Italians, such as the English, especially the British. Okay, so the loss of papal states, the loss of papal power, meant basically that the church, because it has lost all the things, then it had to make sure that its fortifications are properly are well built, so that it's able to withstand. Can you just imagine, being a pope inside this particular castle? Now, if you have a very well built castle like this, then the the revolutionaries will not be able to touch you there. Make sure you secure your windows and you secure your doors, and people will not be able to get in. That is the kind of mentality that prevailed in the church at that time. The church was being attacked by all kinds of forces, humanistic forces, secular forces, even anti-Catholic, anti-Christian culture, etc. Now, the church's response to all this was Vatican I, with the dogma of papal infallibility. Okay. Why is it important to put it in the context, concept of papal infallibility? Of course, from the point of view of theology, I don't think that is such what do you call it, such a debatable question. Everybody knows that because the church is guided by the Spirit, then the church is not able to make a mistake. Because admitting that the church is able to make a mistake means to admit that the Holy Spirit can change its mind or can make a mistake. So in a way, that is something. But people were saying, is this the right time to define papal infallibility in 1879? Is it the right time? By the way, by this time, the Italian, what do you call this, Italian revolutionaries have already reclaimed papal states. So for many people, and especially looking back now, 50 years, 100 years afterwards, you come to realize that from its the wider lens, you will find that this was an attempt on the part of the Pope, Pius IX, and on the part of the Church to insist on having power. You call this, okay, theological power or spiritual power. But nevertheless, it's a way of asserting you may take away all the papal states from me. You may take away everything, the temporal power that I have, but I still have power. And my power is that I am not able to make a mistake. The Pope is infallible. Okay. Of course, many people among the Protestants would say, I mean, why do you find it as such? Is there any human being in this world who is infallible? Without the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I don't think we can say that there is anybody there. But you see, from the wider lens, you could see the reason precisely why papal infallibility was defined was, again, because of, on the part of Pius IX, trying to assert the power of the church, not just the Pope, but the power of the church over that part of Europe or the part of the world, or especially in spiritual realms, in matters of faith and morals. But as you know, in Vatican II, there was a good number of people who either abstained, did not vote positively or negatively, and some also had, in a way, boycotted. They left the council before the votation itself. The reason for that is because there was going to be a war between the Franco-Prussian, the French and the Germans. There were going to be a war. That's the reason why Vatican I was called off. After one session, it was called off because there was a war. So it was not continued at that time. But the other part of the response of the church was from the point of view of philosophy, from the point of view of theology, was to revive scholasticism, to revive the theology of Thomas Aquinas. And so just as the Council of Trent had revived the medieval philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, so also Vatican I went back to the kind of philosophy and theology that was adopted, of course, and what do you call this, exalted by the worldwide church in the Middle Ages as the philosophy or the theology of the church. And that is Aquinas' Aristotelian philosophy and theology. Okay. But it was also an interpretation of the scholastic philosophy that some authors have said, well, they're actually not quite as authentic interpretation of scholastic philosophy and scholastic theology, because it was already colored by what we would call apologetical theology, the idea of using scholastic philosophy and theology in order to prove your point against the reformers. So there was a vested interest in the use of neo-scholastic or scholasticism. That is why people call it a neo-scholastic form of theology. Okay, so there was this apologetical or the controversial part of type of theology that was put in service of the defense of the faith. Aside from that, there was also this whole idea of the Rococo. Rococo is the very decorative, ornamental type of outgrowth from the Baroque era. The Baroque era was the era that came after the Renaissance. The Renaissance was much more, idyllic, pastoral, very, very much in love with nature. But the Rococo and the Baroque was a lot of ornamentation, a lot of decoration. I will show you an example of the Baroque, what do you call this, type of architecture or type of perspective. Too ornamental, too focused on the heavenly and too hostile to the human. And this was, you can see actually the St. Peter's Basilica as an example of the Baroque architecture. And many of the churches especially in southern Germany, very typically Baroque. From the point of view of pastoral action, there developed, of course, what was called the Catholic action. But this was much later in the 1800s because it was Leo XIII who actually tried to organize certain movements to counteract what was basically an anti-church movement that was happening. And the way Leo XIII, for example, envisioned it is the lay people who would be the best person who would counteract this lay movement that is basically anti-Christian, secular, and maybe even atheistic. Okay, so Catholic action, fraternities, sodalities, etc., in response to secularism, and of course the idea that lay people determine actually what should happen in the church because they are the majority. Okay, but this may all seem like negative kind of a response to that idea of the church as a fortress. But there were fresh insights on theology. For example, Johann Adam Möller, who is a German theologian, is basically credited with the fact that he had re-envisioned the church, not just from the point of view of an institutional hierarchical organization, but from the point of view of the church as an organism, a living totality, whose present and past flowed not our, flowed out of diversity in the community. In other words, here we're talking about an organization that is alive, that is functioning, but it's also respectful of the differences that exist between these different groups. They're all united still in faith, and especially in confessing, in acknowledging the leadership of the Roman Pontiff, but especially they're able to he's able to stress the fact that it is something alive, something that we need to participate in because it is an organism. So that is a fresh insight from Johann Adam Muller. Actually, he was just going back to the whole idea of the body of Christ, and the church as the body of Christ. Because if you go back to the letter of Paul, 1 Corinthians, you would find that this is exactly how the church was conceived. It's a living body. It's the body of Christ, where Christ is the head, and all of us are members, and then we affect one another. If there is pain in one part of the body, then the pain is felt by the entire body. Another person who had offered fresh insight was F.A. Staudenmayer. What he was insisting on was the role of the Spirit in the church. Spirit is active in the church, in each individual, serving church and society. So the acknowledgement of the Spirit as being active in the church was in a way saying that, okay, you may declare that the Pope is infallible, yes, but he's infallible by virtue of the power of the Spirit. By the power of the Spirit, the Pope and the Church is able to declare itself as infallible. It is the Spirit. Now, this is a kind of a carryover from what we call the Orthodox theology, because Orthodox theology emphasized a great deal on the Spirit. And the reason for this is because they started to, again, restudy Orthodox theology. What can we learn from the Orthodox theology that we may perhaps have set aside in favor of a very feudalistic hierarchical organization? And then this is what Staudenmayer basically found, the role of the Spirit in the church. Now, in terms of church organization, well, even at this point, bishops were mainly priests who shared what they alone possessed fully and sovereignly. In other words, of course, they considered the bishop as having the fullness of the Spirit, of ordination, the fullness of ordination. And he is only sharing that fullness with his priests. So actually, the real priest is the bishop. Then all the other priests are only sharers in the priesthood of the bishop. That is the mentality at that time. You remember that that kind of thinking makes it look like that we are just, our ordination, our ministry as priests are only dependent on the the ordination charism that has been given to the bishop. Okay, that is, of course, that has been changed slightly by the Second Vatican Council. But worse was we talk about the bishops in relation to the Pope. The bishops were considered as the extensions of the Pope. The ultimate authority, who? The Pope. As in a kingdom, he's on top there of the pyramid. Notice again that in this particular, what I call this organizational structure, they are still following the feudalistic, hierarchical organizational structure of the Middle Ages. So the bishops are like the lords, but they are dependent on the king, who is the Pope, on the Pope, who is the king. So bishops are like the extensions of the Pope. Okay. Whereas when we talk about just a kind of a comparison here, we're making a comparison with the early Christian tradition of a bishop. The bishop is the leader of a particular community. He has authority on his own as a leader of that community. Okay, he may be coordinating with other bishops, but for that particular community, he's not just an extension of, let's say, Peter or the other apostles or the other bigwigs, for example, in bigger centers like Constantinople or Athens or what he calls Alexandria or even Rome. No, he has authority as the local bishop. In other words, during the time of the early fathers, we're talking about the local church as an entity that is respected. That is why they developed their own particular ritual, because they really claim that they are, as a local church, they have a say on how they were going to celebrate the sacraments, how they were going to celebrate the breaking of bread. Now, in this fortress church, lay people had very little to do, except perhaps to be involved in social action and maybe once in a while to pray for their own novenas. They are not able to participate in the celebration of the Eucharist because it's the priest who says those things. They are the ones who celebrate the Eucharist. They are the ones who are the main ministers, and the people, they go there and simply just pray quietly. Because the actual thing that is being done, actual celebration, cultic act that was being done is done by the one who was ordained, the priest. The lay people, dyan lang kayo. But of course, the people will always say, our own idea, we need to, our own spirit, where do we get our spiritual nourishment? Well, all of those things that are outside of what we call the sacramental system, devotions, processions, what we would now call sacramentals. And these are a way of nourishing our spiritual needs because something had to be done. They are no longer able to participate fully in the Eucharist, in the sacrament. So the way of the cross is important. The rosaries would be important because that's their way of communicating with God. Now, okay. The other part in the 1800s, actually late 1700s and the 1800s, was the whole idea of the Romantic movement in all of Europe having an influence in the way the churches were built, in the way that the church would have. I don't know if you're familiar with church music around this time. We talk about the music of Mozart, from Bach, from Mozart, to Beethoven, to Haydn, to Schubert, etc. They all have this. They would compose music, polyphonic music for the masses, and those music would be so long. You repeat "Lord have mercy" maybe 10 times, and you repeat in the Gloria. You repeat some words so many times because that's the romantic way of saying. That's what we would call the Rococo, excessive decoration, excessive flowering, excessive. You can take a look at the church there. This is an example of a Baroque church. But if you look at the ceiling, for example, all kinds of decorations, all kinds of beautiful palamuti, as we would say, all kinds of decorations. And then if you look below and that one particular altar, okay, look at the way it is decorated. You ask yourself, what is really the most important thing about the altar? Where is the cross? Where is the cross? Can you find the cross? It's not there. There's a small cross by the altar. It's a small cross, but the rest of it is you have the sun, you have the spirit, and you have these beautiful pillars, etc. This is basically what we mean when we talk about Baroque. Uh, what do you call this? Baroque Christianity. Now, that Baroque Christianity had its origin, of course, in the monastic orders. During this time, there was this, we talk about the Restoration, remember? Restoration. Remember that in the Middle Ages, the monks were the ones who were what we would call the primary educators at that time. Eventually, of course, they gave way to the colleges and then to the universities. But the monks, their kind of life was considered as, ideal, the ideal kind of life. So monastic orders were restored. And monastic orders, they started to adapting their way of life, the monastic life, to the culture that was prevailing at that time, which was basically Baroque kind of a culture. So necessarily, the kind of services and activities that you will find in the monasteries would be highly romanticized. So in art and in liturgy, the growth, there's a kind of a growth, but it is a growth that is going back to the golden age of Christianity, the high Middle Ages. That was the golden age. So they go back to that. And even not just going back to it, but make it more excessive. Give more what do you call this, decoration to it. Look at the altars there. My God, what a sheer waste of material. Is that sheer waste? No, but for them, that was their expression. That is the way they have expressed. You didn't see for example, the pulpit. The pulpit was also very richly decorated. Why not just simple kind of a simple pulpit? But no, you have all kinds of little things up there. The heavenly things. It makes you think about heaven. Supposed to be that's the whole idea. Makes you think about heaven, the ideal reality. Now, there were also missionary congregations, but the style of religious life mirrored more and more that of the 16th to the 17th century, basically talking about the French school of spirituality. In other words, deeply interior piety. We will see this shortly. But also the whole idea of the monarchical power of the episcopacy. In other words, the Pope or the bishop is like the monarch. He's in charge of one territory and he rules like a monarch. And of course, that movement about ultramontanism, which is basically the movement that beyond the hills of Rome, behind the mountains of Rome, that's why it's called ultramontanism. There are people who still recognize the authority of the Pope as the ultimate authority in the church, which is again talking about a very monarchical, hierarchical, feudalistic type of organization. Okay. Now, missionary congregations are also considered as charismatic groups, but only to a certain extent. But they have to be under the authority and under the control of the bishops, who basically are the ones in charge of the church. And so even yes, as there are some religious congregations going to the diocese, but the diocesan bishop has basically a say on whether to accept or not to accept them into their dioceses, or whether certain things could be controlled by the bishop himself. And in some instances, some of the even up to now, some of the bishops do not really understand the idea of the religious communities as being charismatic communities. They think that because they have the power, then they have the power to control everything that is there in their diocese. Piety became more and more interior. Of course, when the priest celebrates Mass quietly and in Latin, You have a kind of a spirituality that's developed, a more interior kind of, not the, okay, if there's going to be singing, it's going to be a polyphony, it's going to be a symphony, they're going to be singing all those beautiful masses of Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, etc., etc. But the more important thing is to develop your own sense of spirituality. You develop your interior life. Notice those of you who have finished already the novitiate, the whole idea of I'm developing my own interior life. I am not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm talking about the emphasis, the focus. The focus is on life, on the interior life. Ministry, of course, is reaching out to others, but you're able to reach out to others if you develop your own prayer life, your own interior life. You read, you look for your own perfection of your own holiness. I can tell you about these things because that's exactly what I had done when I was in the novitiate. That is what they call. But aside from that, aside from the piety becoming interior, what shows outside, are all this extra stuff that you find cardinals and bishops wear. The vestments, in their attire, and they are like, almost brides, parading when the bishop comes, with all the paraphernalia, etc. And somebody has to carry the train, and you have to spend so much money for that. That is what is called the bella figura of churchmen. Churchmen, bishops, and company, and cardinals more interested in the type of silk that they use for their vestments, or the length of their the kappa that is supposed to be they're using when they are installed, or the type of surplice that they use, and the kind of sutana that they use, etc. That became more and more the focus. Sounds family? Sounds familiar? Well, we still have some people like that in the church nowadays. We're very interested in, I have to make sure I have the best vestments, beautiful vestments. Okay, all right. Some people like that. Okay, to each his own taste, I guess. Now, in regard to ministry itself, even that was also romanticized. Now, I have to be very careful here because there are some seminarians who probably will be disappointed with me talking about Cure de Ars. John Mary Vianney, who is the model of the diocesan clergy, of course, patron saint of the diocesan clergy. There is no doubt that he was a very holy and a very dedicated man, and he spent years and years hearing confession, so he was very good at that. But if you look at his kind of spirituality as a diocesan priest, you will find that spirituality is something that is much more like the spirituality of a monk, the spirituality of what is this? A hermit, spirituality of a person who is so much, so deeply interior, deeply pious. But what about the other part of his ministry? Okay, he is hearing confession. That's already a good what he calls. Maybe he did not have enough time to do all kinds of pastoral work outside of the confessional. That was probably his own ministry. Yes, but I am not putting down the Cure de Ars. I like John Mary Vianney very much. In fact, one of my inspirations also. But that kind of spirituality is a very inward-looking kind of spirituality. Okay. And as I said, I don't have anything against inward-looking kind of spirituality. But a full Christian spirituality has to be inward-looking as well as outside-looking. It has to be both inward-looking and outside-looking. So now, do many of our diocesan priests consider Cure de Ars as their model? They always say he's their model. But do they live like him? I doubt. Whether we have. How about the priest in Negros, for example, in San Carlos? Sunday. You're the priest. Do they find Cure de Ars as as the model of the diocesan clergy? Okay, nice. In terms of spirituality, yes, but all other things. Would he be a model for the kind of ministry that you need when you have to go up the mountains? You have to go to those barrios, etc., etc. Okay. But all I'm saying here is that this is an example of the idea of romanticizing ministry, romanticizing it in such a way that it becomes so pietistic in a sense that you cultivate your own interior life, and that you and I have seen people who were very much like this. But fortunately, those same people I have seen were also very much missionaries. They are really devoted to the work with the poor. Okay. Now, I can tell you that in all the years that I have been involved in the training of the diocesan clergy, the biggest question is always, what is the diocesan spirituality, or what should be the spirituality of the diocesan clergy? Would Cure de Ars be an example of it? Or could there be other things? Could there be other way? From the point of view of interior personal piety, yes, Cure de Ars. But is that something that is the experience of most diocesan priests? I don't think so. So you have to look for the kind of spiritual that is more active, because that is your kind of ministry. That's the kind of ministry you're involved in. You're active. But in your activity, you find your spirituality. So that is another subject, of course. I'm only using Cure de Ars as an example of what it means to romanticize ministry at this time. Okay. Definitely, there is ministerial diversity, ecclesial variety, but outside of the parish in the diocese. Okay. But in the parish, you follow this, you follow that. Some of the public services have been reduced because now they did not understand what the priest was doing. The official church functions, Eucharist, sacraments, were assigned to the ordained members of the church. The remnants or rock-solid vestiges of the sacerdotalization of ministry. In other words, using ministry or looking at ministry purely from the perspective of the cultic office of the priest. By the way, the image of the church there that you see is already Vatican II, because the altar is facing the people. Before, it was of course facing the God. But I simply use this because of the idea of the retablo. If you go to different churches, older churches here in the Philippines, all throughout, go to the eastern part of Cebu, the island of Cebu, for example, all those different places. I've been there, I've visited them, and I like all those places. What is common about them? They all have a retablo like this. Retablo, which is the altar, full of saints. Why do we need all of those saints? And then you say, what happened to the cross? Where is the cross? I thought that is a central symbol of our salvation. What happened to them, to the cross? You see, that is what I find objectionable in regard to the retablo. When you obfuscate the real symbol, which is the cross, in favor of these different statues of the saints, etc., then I think you are doing the wrong thing, because the central figure should be the cross. And that is why even here in the Santuario, we always insist that we have the cross. And it's a very big cross, because that is the number one symbol in it. I remember once going to the cathedral in Palo. Again, you have also kind of a retablo. This was supposed to be maybe the 25th anniversary of Palo as a diocese. When I went there and I started looking, where is the cross? Where is the cross? Oh, a very small cross right in the middle, right at the back of the altar. But all the rest was just, wow, all the beautiful things. Now, I make mention of this because there continues to be that fetish, what I will call fetish, for retablos in the churches. Okay. All the renovation in the churches nowadays we all go back to the idea of having a retablo like this. Instead of thinking in a different way, instead of thinking in terms of the reform of the Second Vatican Council. As I said, I have nothing against retablo per se. But when the retablo already diminishes the importance of what is happening in the liturgy and the Eucharist, then I would say it doesn't help. It doesn't help. It promotes devotional piety, etc., to the different saints, but it doesn't bring out the whole meaning of the Eucharist. So replace it. Replace it. I had a quarrel with Archbishop Cruz one time, the late Archbishop Cruz, when he went to our church in Sucat, and he wanted to change the image of the altar there in Sucat, and he wanted to put a retablo there. I objected. I told him no, cannot be done. Cannot be done. I would not agree. He was very unhappy. He never came back to to talk about it. But anyway, I told him, no, it cannot be done. Cannot be done. Okay, so you already know my idea about the retablos. To a certain extent, they may be useful, but please make sure that you emphasize in the retablo what has to be emphasized. Okay. All right, so that is as far as Vatican I, moving towards Vatican II. The second period is what we would call the period of renewal or renewals.